So this course is called Buddhism in a Nutshell, and it's designed to be an introductory course, even for people who know nothing about Buddhism whatsoever. And for that reason, we don't usually say any. In most centers, you say some various Buddhist prayers at the beginning, but for this course, we don't, because we want people who are just interested in Buddhism to be able to show up and feel comfortable and not feel like they have any sort of religion sort of imposed on them. And many times in this course, I have taught people who are just curious about Buddhism, and I think that's wonderful. It's also a very useful course for people who are experienced Buddhists, even very experienced Buddhists, because it gives you an opportunity in a very short time, essentially 4 meetings of an hour and a half each, to cover all of Buddhism, to see the really big picture. And for many people, that's extremely helpful, because they start off going to a center and they learn about this detail or they learn about that detail, but they never see the whole thing put together as a package. And so for that reason, it can be very helpful. I always, whenever I study any subject, I always try to get the big picture first and then fill in the details. That's how my mind works. There are other people who like the details and then fill in the big picture, but it doesn't matter either way. So this is going to be a very broad look at Buddhism. So what are the sort of things that we will look at in this class? First of all, we will look at who Buddha was, give a bio of his life, and and then from there talk about how the history of Buddhism, how Buddhism spread over all the different countries. And also, I think, which is quite interesting, I mean, Buddhism is roughly 2,500 years old, since Buddha lived around 500 BC. So there's been a lot of developments in Buddhism over these 2,500 years. And so I will also talk about the major developments of how Buddhism developed, especially the Mahayana Buddhism. And then in addition, I want to just even talk about general things. Who is a Buddhism? Who is a Buddhist? What does it mean to be a Buddhist? Do you have to go through a ceremony or anything special? And also, I want to, as much as possible, be very practical. I want to talk about how you actually practice Buddhism. So what are the key things that Buddhists actually do in their practice? And also, as much as possible, I always want to talk about why we do things, why things develop the way they are. What is the background? How do you understand what's going on? And for me, I can only feel comfortable in any subject if I have sort of my own understanding of it. If I can sort of put all the pieces together in a logical framework. And so I've done that for myself, and that's what I will transmit to you as well. And the other final thing too is that everyone should feel comfortable to ask questions. These courses are almost all extremely small, usually just a few people. And so it's a special opportunity to ask really almost any question you have about Buddhism. And in fact, I see that as almost the main purpose of this course. Because a lot of times people feel intimidated in big classes, and they have something that bothers them, or they don't quite understand, or it's always seemed crazy for them. But usually they're often intimidated to speak up in a big group. Whereas in this one class, you actually have an opportunity. Let's see, I just turned on the recording for this. I just changed the setting a little bit so that in all the recordings, I'm the only, so if any of you speak, you won't show up on screen, which I think is nice, because I don't, again, thinking of intimidation and wanting people to feel comfortable. So again, I mean, this is really a chance. So, and sometimes I try to be even a little bit provocative in my statements, because I want to encourage people actually to sort of catch people on things so that they follow along, because usually people do much better in a course if they do that. Okay, so now, and of course, some of the other things that I want to talk about is I want to talk about terminology, because a lot of times people take Buddhist classes and they get confused by the Buddhist terminology, which sounds strange to them. And often, it's just assumed that people know this terminology, and so people feel a little bit lost. So it's important to explain what the different terms in Buddhism mean. Okay. And then I think the final thing that I want to really emphasize, and I think it's not appreciated as much as it should be, but Buddhism is actually a radical way of looking at the world. It's very different than the modern way of looking at the world. And I want to try to develop some sort of understanding of that. And so as I go along, I will try to point that out to you. And although to me, it's an extraordinarily beautiful way of looking at the world, but it sort of goes against the grain of the modern, if you like, materialistic, everything out for greed, money. It is exactly the sort of opposite to that. Okay, so to begin with, I want to actually do something a little bit different for this class that I haven't done in the past. I want to actually start out, since we're talking about Buddhism in a nutshell, I think an interesting question to ask is, if you were to ask Buddha what Buddhism in a nutshell would mean, what would he say? And so I picked out just a small number of sentences from the Buddhist sutras, which are the record of what Buddha actually taught when he was alive. And so I just want to give a very brief statement of how the Buddha would answer and did answer in some of the sutra. So these are actually the words of Buddha. And in fact, for the first two sentences, which are very short, I even want to give it in the ancient Pali language, because I love languages, and I think it's really amazing to hear things in the original language. So Buddha himself spoke a dialect of Sanskrit, sort of the local dialects in the region where he lived. And it's not absolutely clear that Pali is identical with the dialect that he spoke, but it would be very, very similar. And the words that I'm going to say are almost practically Sanskrit. So let me start. So he said, Samadhim bhikkhave bhavita. So what does that mean? So the very first word, and first words are always important. So Samadhim means concentration, or what we would call meditation. And bhikkhave is just monks. A bhikkhu in the ancient Indian language is a monk. So he says, Samadhim, concentration, O monks, bhikkhave, bhavita, cause to become, or as we would translate it today, develop. So in this very first sentence, the Buddha says, O monks, develop meditation. And then he goes on, he explains why. He says, Samahito bhikkhave, bhikkhu, yata bhutam pajanati. So bhikkhu again, bhikkhave again, O monks. Samahito bhikkhu, a concentrated monk, a monk who is meditating, yata bhutam, as it really is, pajanati, understands. So he's saying that it is through concentration or meditation that you can actually understand the world as it really is. And what is the most important thing to understand about the world, according to Buddha? He says, here I'm going to switch all to English because the Sanskrit words get very long and complicated. So he says, what it is that he understands is that a meditating monk understands, as it really is, this is suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is a cessation of suffering, and this is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. In modern language, these are called the Four Noble Truths. Actually, in the ancient language, these were also called the Four Noble Truths, and I'm going to spend a lot of time explaining them. And I will mention that this word suffering is a limited English translation. It actually means more generally unsatisfactory. And I'm going to spend a great deal of time explaining that. And then the conclusion that Buddha says is therefore, monks, make an exertion to understand these Four Noble Truths. And as we will see, this is the way to what's called enlightenment, or another terminology that we will explain is liberation from samsara. So another thing that Buddha also talked about, and again, I'm going to be very, very brief here. This is just giving you some language, is the fourth noble truth is how do you stop all of your suffering? And the Buddha said there is a noble eightfold way, which is the path, again, that leads to liberation, that leads to reducing all of your suffering. And this is right view, right intention or right thought, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration or meditation. And this is sometimes summarized as the three higher trainings: the higher training in moral discipline, a higher training in concentration or meditation, and the higher training in wisdom. And as we will talk about some more, in the Buddhist path, it's actually understanding or wisdom that leads to liberation, to samsara or enlightenment. However, this is not just ordinary human understanding. This is a really powerful spiritual understanding. And this type of spiritual understanding, where you penetrate the actual reality of the way the world really is, can only be done with a very focused and concentrated mind. So you need meditation for that, so that you can develop this powerful mind that enables you to do this kind of penetration of reality. And then, so you need both wisdom and concentration. But in order to have a focused, concentrated mind, you have to sort of practice basic morality, by which we mean non-harmfulness. Because if you're doing all of these negative things, as we will talk about in great detail, it disturbs your mind. And when you have a disturbed mind that's all over the place, you can't develop this kind of focused mind. So all of these three things sort of work together, and I will explain more. And interestingly enough, these two different things, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Way, actually, the Noble Eightfold Way actually interpenetrate each other, because the Noble Eightfold Path is sort of the fourth noble truth, the way leading to the cessation of suffering. And so in a certain sense, you could say that the Noble Eightfold Path is included in the Four Noble Truths. Alternatively, the very first item in the Noble Eightfold Way is right view, and right view is basically understanding the Four Noble Truths. So you could say that the Four Noble Truths are included in the Noble Eightfold Way. But the Noble Eightfold Way is actually how you practice Buddhism. And so we will spend a lot of time explaining that in detail. And then I think to sort of end this brief thing of the Buddha and then start the real main part of the course, well, I want to do a little bit more introduction, but it's interesting to just quote a couple things Buddha said. Buddha said to his disciples, he said, "Whatever should be done, bhikkhus," that is the monks, "by a compassionate teacher out of compassion for his disciples, desiring their welfare, that I have done for you," meaning that he provided all the essential teachings that his disciples needed. These, and then he pointed, "These are the feet of trees, bhikkhus. These are empty huts. Meditate, bhikkhus. Do not be negligent, lest you regret it later. This is our instruction to you." So there is, in Buddhism, there is a lot of emphasis on meditation. And I will spend time explaining why that is and how it works and more about that. And finally, I think one thing that is another interesting last quote before getting into the main part is Buddha's last words. Just before Buddha died, he said, "All conditioned things are of a nature to decay. Strive on untiringly." And this first part is complicated, but basically in Buddhism, one of the most important teachings is everything in our lives is impermanent. And that has a profound impact on our spiritual life. So the Buddha reminded us of the impermanence, even Buddha's life, his natural life. He died. And Buddha always said, everything that is born dies. That's the nature of our world. And then his final thing, though, is strive on untiringly. Another translation of this is strive to attain the goal by diligence. And I think that's sort of the most important aspect of Buddhism. Buddhism is a continual practice where you gradually, step by step, work toward enlightenment. It's not these giant leaps. It's a gradual, continuous spiritual path. And I think the most important thing of all is to persevere. And the other thing that Buddha talks a lot about is a lot about cause and effect. And Buddha always said that if you want something to happen, you have to develop the causes for it. And if you develop those causes for it, it will happen. And this is the same truth for enlightenment. So Buddha said, if you create the causes to become enlightened, then you are going to become enlightened. There's no doubt whatsoever. You can't stop yourself. And so in a certain sense, our spiritual life is all about creating those causes for enlightenment. Okay, so enough. So given this little brief introduction, this sort of Buddhism in a nutshell by Buddha, which these teachings that he gave, I took from one part, but he repeated these things many, many different times during his 45 years of teaching. So what do we learn about Buddhism from these words of Buddha? First of all, what I think is quite interesting is you can ask, which many people have, is Buddhism actually a religion? Because you notice that in these little quotations that I gave, there's no religious ceremony, there's no incense, sacred words, whatever, but there's just this quiet strive on, persevere. And so that's the other aspect, is that there's no priest who's going to be waving his hands and cause you to become enlightened. We each have to become enlightened through our own perseverance, through our own efforts. Of course, there are monks to teach us, to guide us on the way. The Buddha gave extensive teachings of thousands of details. Sometimes they say that he gave 80,000 teachings or something. So huge numbers of practical hints for how to achieve this goal and how to persevere, what to do if you get stuck and so forth. So there's a lot of guidance, but in the end, it's up to us. Buddha said he can't wave his hands and make us enlightened. And there's actually a reason, and you can actually understand why that has to be. And that has to be that, as we will learn, as I'll get into in more detail, it's actually the negativities in our own mind that prevent us from becoming enlightened. And so to become enlightened really involves changing our own mind. And the only person who can change our own mind is ourselves. We have to change our own mind. And so it's up to us to achieve enlightenment, of course, with a lot of help. Okay, so that's the first thing. And also, there's no sin, punishment, evil spirits and so forth. Also, there's a lot of things. So for that reason, when Westerners first encountered Buddhism, they actually questioned whether it was a religion or not. Of course, as Buddhism developed, many different forms of Buddhism, as it developed in different countries, did develop a lot of religious ceremony and so forth. Especially the Tibetan form of Buddhism has a huge amount of very elaborate ritual. I think largely because the Tibetans like ritual. They've always liked ritual. And so when Buddhism came, they incorporated a lot of ritual in their form of Buddhism. But there are other forms of Buddhism that have very little ritual, like Zen Buddhism and so forth. So, but we will come and talk more about that. So we will explain for those types that do have religious ceremony, how does that work? And why do they have these religious trappings, and what are they supposed to do? Okay, so the other thing too is that in these first four things, these Four Noble Truths, there's this talk about suffering. In fact, when when Westerners first encountered Buddhism, when they started going to the East, they used to call Buddhism the dismal science, because they said, these guys, they just run around talking about suffering all the time. What's wrong with these guys? Why can't they be happy and have a life? And I think that's actually a wrong interpretation. In fact, one of the things that attracted me to Buddhism was I always felt like all the Buddhist monks are extremely happy and laughing all the time. Even the Dalai Lama, in the midst of the most serious religious ceremony, will sometimes break out laughing. And so Buddhism really isn't about so much focusing on suffering. Actually, the flip side of suffering is happiness. And what Buddha explains is that if you follow the spiritual life, it'll actually make your life better, and you will become happier and happier the further you progress on the spiritual life. And in fact, the higher spiritual achievements actually are these very blissful meditative states, far more blissful than any sort of ordinary human pleasure. And in fact, Nirvana itself, or enlightenment, again, I will come back and talk about these terms more in detail, but enlightenment is supposed to be the highest bliss possible. And you can approach that, you can experience aspects of this, especially through higher ranges of meditation. Even in this life, you can experience these types of bliss. And in fact, these types of bliss are actually considered to be very helpful for developing a highly concentrated mind. The Buddha himself always said this, that as you get happier with this spiritual type of happiness, not samsaric, but spiritual, it actually focuses your mind, and your mind becomes more powerful. But again, we will talk about that some more. Okay. So the other thing too is that there's no talk about fate. So Buddhism isn't about having some doctrine that you have to memorize and believe to be true. Buddha always said that that the Dharma, what he called the Buddhist teachings, are something to be directly experienced. There's a huge emphasis in Buddhism on direct spiritual experience. And this is probably most easily achieved, again, in meditation, where you are focused inward. But but the emphasis, the way you become liberated is through understanding, through actually seeing the world as it really is. And in fact, we have these negativities in our mind, which I will talk about, the three poisons, greed, for example, hatred, and delusion or ignorance. But how do you overcome these? Because most of the time, for most people, we're overwhelmed by these strong emotions. And actually, the way through it is ultimately through deep understanding. We understand the world as it really is. We see how these three poisons affect us, how they make us unhappy. And ultimately, we can't help ourselves. We have to get rid of them because they're just too painful. We don't want them. We want the bliss of the spiritual form of happiness. But again, I will talk more about this. We're just in the introduction. Another thing, too, is that Buddha said, basically, enlightenment is possible for everybody. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if you create the causes for enlightenment, you will become enlightened. And in fact, many of the disciples of Buddha, while Buddha was alive, actually did become enlightened while still alive. You can all, well, I'll explain more details of this later. But anyway, so enlightenment is not an impossibility. However, what I will say is that we Americans tend to be completely goal-focused, and we tend to sort of overemphasize the end goal too much. And so people, when they come to Buddhism, it's sort of enlightenment or bust. It's sort of like, oh, you know, if I'm not enlightened, my whole Buddhist life is a waste or something like that. And I think that's the wrong point of view to take. In my personal practice, what I feel is most important is to make my life happier moment by moment, which means as I practice the spiritual life moment by moment, I feel happier. In fact, my short-term goal is just to become a better person every single day. And my belief is that's all you need to do. That's what you need to focus on, is Buddha tells you how to lead a happier life. And the instructions are really not that complicated. And if you practice that, you can directly see for yourself how things work, and you can directly see for yourself that you are becoming happier. And if you do that, I think Nirvana, Enlightenment, all the rest will take care of itself. And so for me, I would say don't get too hung up on enlightenment, because I think that's sort of a, that creates difficulties for people, and then people get frustrated. Well, I've been studying for 3 years now. Why aren't I enlightened? Sort of thing. And so I think it's better to view Buddhism as a path, and to enjoy that path, actually. Okay. And then, as I said, there is this emphasis on meditation. And meditation doesn't have to be really complicated. We teach courses in beginning meditation at our center. And there's sort of two main types of meditation, sort of a single-minded focus of the mind where you focused on a single thing. And there's also a type of meditation, which is sort of called mindfulness or insight meditation, which is actually the way that you penetrate the nature of reality. And in fact, you can penetrate your own psychology with this. You can actually see all of your emotions and how you're experiencing the world in a very direct way through this sort of mindfulness meditation. It's extremely powerful. And these two forms of meditation usually go hand in hand. You usually need some single-pointed meditation to learn how to focus your mind. In other words, not to be distracted all over the place. And then with a little bit of that focus, you then can practice this mindfulness meditation a little more easily with less distraction. Okay, so let me, so some of these things I've already talked about. Yeah, and another important thing too is that, again, this notion of faith. So Buddha did talk about faith, and he actually said it was very important. But in Buddhism, faith is not the blind faith that we sometimes encounter, perhaps in other religions. It doesn't mean, the Buddha always said, don't believe me just because I'm the Buddha and I said these things. What the Buddha always said is that you should see these things for yourself. Try out what I've suggested and see whether it works for you. And that is always sort of the way that Buddhism really works. It's really about experiential encounters with the world, actually trying these things out and seeing for yourself that they really work. And in the higher levels, especially through meditation, which is very powerful, sometimes these things really become very clear. And so again, there's this emphasis on understanding, but understanding directly for yourself, not just being, it's sort of, Buddhism is sort of anti-authoritarian in that way, so to speak. And again, Buddhism is a gradual path. You just have to be patient with it and just keep practicing. And my experience with it is that the longer I practice, the more true it seems, the more happier I feel. And in a certain sense, this faith that Buddha talked about is really just confidence. And it's confidence derived from your own experience. You see for yourself that it actually works and makes sense. And that's why you have faith in it. And that encourages you to try the other things that the Buddha talked about. And then the final thing is that in this little teaching, there's no emphasis about an organized religion. Of course, even in Buddha's time, there was, in a sense, an organization. He had these thousands of monks who followed him, and they had elder monks who sort of took care of them and taught the younger monks. And they, so many people, you had to organize a monastic life, and there were monastic rules. But in general, everything that was done in all of these rules was done for practicality. There's several books of Vinaya, the Buddhist rules of discipline or how to live for monks. However, all of these rules that were in this book were developed from specific practical things that happened. So each rule that's in the Vinaya came about because of some problem that arose in the monastic community. There would be some problem, and they would come to Buddha, and Buddha would say, okay, we'll solve this dispute or this problem with this way, and he would lay out a rule to make it easier for the monks to live in harmony. And so, and so there is that sort of practicality. And in fact, just before the Buddha died, he told his chief attendant, Ananda, he said, once I'm gone, if you want, you can actually just throw out a bunch of the minor rules and just keep the major ones. It's no big deal. So the Buddha himself was very relaxed about these sort of rules. I mean, and again, it's like everything in Buddhism. The rules are there for a purpose. And if they serve a purpose, if they can allow the monastic community to live better and to live and help their spiritual life, then keep them. If they don't work, then throw them out. However, when Buddha said this later on, unfortunately, Ananda forgot to ask him which rules he considered minor. So after the Buddha died, all the monks were afraid to throw out any of them because they didn't know which ones he meant. So anyway, they never did throw out any of them. But I thought it was interesting. And then the final thing, before I switch over into, again, more of the meat of the course, is one thing I've always found very interesting, especially with this notion of organized religion, is just before Buddha died, many of the monks around him said, what's going to happen to us after you're gone? We've got this, these thousands and thousands of monks, and who's going to lead them? Can you appoint someone to lead all the monks to sort of be your replacement? Sort of, in my mind, this is sort of the what I like to call the Pope of Buddhism. The guy that takes over after the main person's gone. So all these Buddhists were essentially saying, appoint some pope, somebody to lead us, somebody to watch over us, because we might struggle after you're gone. And the Buddha point blank always refused to do this. What the Buddha always said is, he says, I gave you the teachings, the Dharma. These teachings, the Dharma, are all that you need. Just follow the teachings. You don't need a pope to lead you. And of course, there was a large community of elder monks who knew everything that Buddha taught forwards and backwards. And so there were people to act as guides. But I think out of a great wisdom, the Buddha refused to appoint any head guy. And so as a result of that, Buddhism has never been a completely organized religion like Catholicism, for example. In Catholicism, you have the Catholic Church, and you have this huge hierarchy, and you had all of these popes who followed each other, who were always the leaders, and they sort of laid down the law of what the religion was about. In Buddhism, it's never been that way. And for that reason, Buddhism is always sort of splintered and developed in different ways. And so there was nobody who could actually claim to have any authority. So again, this is this sort of anti-authoritarianism of Buddhism, sort of an egalitarianism. It's really the Dharma, it's the Buddhist teachings that matter, not what some person tells you to do. And for that reason, there's many different types of Buddhism in the world. At various times in various countries, I will explain further how Buddhism developed. Great spiritual leaders, people of very deep, deep spirituality would appear, and many people would follow them. And then that would develop one form of Buddhism, like Zen Buddhism. There's 4 different types of Tibetan Buddhism, which are associated with individuals and so forth. But anyway, I will come to that some more as we go into the history of Buddhism. But it's quite interesting that, so even the Dalai Lama can't run around and tell other Buddhists what to do, because he's not the Pope of Buddhism. He can't tell Zen Buddhists how we should practice. In fact, the Dalai Lama can't even tell a lot of Tibetans how they should practice. Of course, the Tibetans revere the Dalai Lama and would probably do whatever he said, but there's actually 4 different versions of Buddhism in Tibet. And the Buddha just actually formally belongs to just one of them, the Gelug tradition. And even then, he's not the head of the Gelug tradition. So anyway, it's quite interesting. So we'll continue. I mean, I think this will pop up again and again as we go through the history. But it's something that I've always found quite interesting about Buddhism. It is actually part of the reason why I really like Buddhism. I'm sort of an anti-authoritarian person myself. So let's talk about Buddha himself. So who was Buddha and what happened in his life? So Buddha actually has several different names. The full name that is finally given, that he's usually given, is Buddha Shakyamuni. And Buddha itself, the word Buddha in Sanskrit and in these ancient languages, really means someone who has awakened. And so in some sense, you could take this that Buddha is the person who awakened to the truth of the world, how the world really is. Shakyamuni is the name given to him because Shakya was a clan name. So as we will explain, he lived in a small kingdom in northern India. His father was the king, and he was the prince. He was the guy that was supposed to grow up and take over the kingdom eventually. And that whole clan that around that area where he lived was the Shakya clan. And Muni just means sort of sage or wise person. So that's just sort of an honorific that got added to Shakya. So he was called Buddha Shakyamuni. And sometimes in his life, he would refer to himself as the Tathagata or the Blessed One, Sugata. There were other terminologies that were used. But anyway, the name is perhaps not so important. When he was young, he was actually called Prince Siddhartha. So there's a famous book by Hermann Hesse called Siddhartha. And that's because, and the other name that he has is sometimes he was called Gautama Siddhartha. Gautama, again, was sort of a family name. So he went by these various names. But largely, when he grew up in India so when did he live? And that is a little bit complicated. I always like to think of it as roughly 500 BC. It turns out that it's actually difficult to establish the actual date with a lot of accuracy, not because Buddhists are lax or anything. It's just because that in ancient India, the culture of ancient India actually didn't care a lot about precise dating. I think some of it comes from the ancient Vedic religion, where they considered the Vedics as timeless truths. And so why worry about dates when you have these timeless truths running around? But for whatever reason, dating of anybody in ancient India around the time that Buddha lived is quite difficult. And scholars have to use a lot of indirect methods to try to estimate when he actually lived. And so there is some people who believe that he was born quite earlier, maybe 566 BC is a date that some people say. And he roughly lived 80 years, so add 80 years for his death. And there's some people who think that he was born later, more like 448 BC, and again lived 80 years after that. So we don't really know. So I think averaging it all out and saying 500 BC is probably good enough. The precise date really doesn't matter that much anyway. So anyway, and what was the climate of India where he lived? It was basically almost like medieval times in Europe. You had all these lots of little kingdoms that were all vying for power. And interestingly enough, some of them were actually republics. So there were small republics as well as kingdoms. And some people have even suggested that Buddha's little country was a republic, but I think it's sort of unclear. And so just like in medieval Europe, all of these various people were always fighting with their neighbors, trying to take over their little kingdom and sort of expand. And these battles would go back and forth. There were some larger units, just like in medieval Europe. There was some people were sort of vassals of larger kingdoms. And in fact, it is believed that this little Sakyan kingdom was a vassal of a neighboring area called Kosala, so that they were sort of officially under them. Okay, but this doesn't matter so much. But anyway, the Buddha, when he was born, and they're sort of almost like it's hard to know. There were descriptions. Some of these descriptions actually come from Buddha himself, but there were descriptions that when Buddha was born, there were many auspicious signs, like his mother would have special dreams and so forth. And they actually asked a soothsayer or, a local prophet to sort of predict what would happen to Buddha, because they thought that he was, even when he was being carried in the womb, that he was this very important person who was going to be born. And this soothsayer or prophet or seer, whatever you want to call them, said, oh, well, there's two things: that indeed this person who's being born is going to be a very powerful person, and he can turn out two ways. One, he can follow sort of a secular path where he will become this very, very powerful king that will rule over this very large kingdom. Or he can turn toward a spiritual path and become a great spiritual leader. So this actually, these dreams and so forth actually have implications for what happened to Buddha in his life. So basically, there's a lot of things, a lot of marvelous things that happened when Buddha was born. But again, it's not so important for our path, so I won't get into it. I guess one thing that we should mention is that his mother died very shortly after giving birth to him. So I forget whether it was a month or a few months, or she died, I think, within the first year of when Buddha was born. So actually, Buddha was raised by one of his mother's sisters, one of his aunts, when he was growing up. And when he was growing up, he grew up in great luxury. I mean, he was supposed to be the future king. And in fact, his father viewed the secular path for him as being the one he really wanted. He wanted his son to become this great, powerful king. So he tried to discourage Buddha from any sort of spiritual path and tried to sort of sequester him and surround him with luxury, beautiful women. Buddha himself said that when he was growing up, he had 3 different palaces. There are 3 different major seasons of India, and he had a different palace for each season. It was staffed with all of these beautiful women who would play music, would be musicians, and take care of all of his needs. So he was really sort of pushed toward the secular path. He eventually, of course, he had an excellent education as a young. He was being trained to be a king, so he had the best education you could possibly get. Eventually, he did marry another neighboring princess called Yasodhara, And he actually had one son called Rahula. And just about the time that his only son, Rahula, was being born, it's said that three messengers came to the Buddha. And this is a little bit metaphorical. What it was is that the Buddha was always curious about the outside world. I mean, his father was sort of doing everything he could to sort of keep Buddha away from everybody else because he was afraid he might meet some spiritual teacher and turn toward a spiritual path. But on three occasions, the Buddha managed to escape. And when he did that, the first time, he saw a sick person. And when he saw a sick person, he was actually really revolted. He was totally upset. He was saying, this is terrible that people have all this sort of sickness. You know, this should not happen. A second time he escaped and he saw an old person and he realized, you know, it's like everybody becomes old. This is really terrible. It's terrible that we have to become old. And the third messenger was he saw a corpse, and it reminded him of death, that all human beings die. Sometimes it's said that there's a fourth messenger, that he saw some kind of spiritual wandering ascetic, but that's maybe less clear. But at any rate, what happened to the Buddha, according to the story, is that Buddha decided that human suffering was unacceptable and that there had to be some way out, some solution, some way that you could stop all of this suffering. And he made this personal determination, I'm going to find this way. I'm convinced that there is some way to do this, and I'm going to find it. So you can sort of see how this relates to the Four Noble Truths. And then he escaped from the palace, you know, and this was just shortly after his first son had been born. And he escaped from the palace, he shaved off his head, and he became a wandering ascetic. At that period of India, and actually even today, there is this tradition of wandering ascetics, people who have no money, who beg for all of their food, medicine, or a place to live, often live in the forests or jungles, and teach all sorts of millions of different types of spiritualism, some of them very coarse, like materialism, others very esoteric. I think that's where the Upanishads ultimately came out of. But anyway, the traditional religion in India were the Vedas, where the Brahmins were the priests, and it was sort of a religion of sacrifice. And the Brahmins were in charge of all of these sacrifices, and they were very powerful beings. And there was also a caste system at that time, not as well developed as it was eventually, but essentially the two highest levels of the caste at that time were either the Brahmins or sort of the warrior class, which the Buddha belonged to. And it's not clear, the warrior class at that time might have been more powerful than the Brahmins, but eventually, from the history of India, we know that ultimately the Brahmins won out and became the most powerful, highest level caste in India as it is today. But at any rate, you had these wandering ascetics, and so Buddha went and joined these, and he found a good spiritual teacher to teach him how to meditate, and he sort of, from this teacher, he learned a very high level meditation, which many people in India had highly developed, very high forms of meditation, very deep meditation. So the Buddha learned, originally he just followed this guy, but then eventually he decided, you know, whatever this guy knows, I'm strong, I'm young, I can put my mind to it and I can do it. I can become just as developed as he is in this meditation. And in fact, he achieved that. He achieved the same level as his teacher. And in fact, his teacher offered at that point to make him a co-leader of his little religious group. But the Buddha said, you know, I've gone as far as I can with you, but I still haven't solved this problem of suffering. And this is not satisfactory. So he left this religious teacher and wandered and found somebody who knew an even higher level of meditation, sort of the some of the highest levels of meditation you can achieve. And once again, the Buddha put his mind to it and completely developed this form of meditation. And in fact, that teacher was so impressed with the Buddha, he says, look, you should take over this thing. I'll become your follower. But again, the Buddha was disturbed because he hadn't solved this problem of the truth of suffering, how to solve suffering. And so at that point, the Buddha wandered probably for about 5 years or so. In total, he left his palace at the age of 29, and he became a Buddha at the age of 35. And so for these 6 years, he was wandering as an ascetic in the forests and jungles of India. And so after he left this other teacher, he actually joined a group of 5 other people. They formed this little band, and they practiced extreme asceticism. So this thing that was they were actually destroying their health, the sort of thing like you might eat 1 grain of rice a week or some ridiculous thing like that. And in fact, there are some sculptures where people try to portray this period of Buddha's life. And the Dalai Lama loves this one sculpture, which shows Buddha with all of his bones sticking out. And in fact, the Buddha, when he later gave teachings, described this period, and he says that that's how it was. At that period, all of his bones were sticking out. His hair was falling out because he was doing this. He wasn't eating anything. He was just meditating day and night. But the problem is Buddha felt like he wasn't getting anywhere. And in fact, Buddha came almost to the point of death because his asceticism, he was so strongly determined to solve this problem of suffering that he went to the nth degree, almost killing himself. But then at the end, one day he sat down and realized this just isn't working. And according to the story, I think this might have been told by Buddha himself, he remembered a time when he was a young boy, just sort of idly watching his father bless the fields, these sort of things that kings do to promote agriculture. And he was just sort of idly meditating. And he had this delightful meditation that was really blissful. And it felt right to him. And he says, it suddenly just hit him. That's what I should be doing. That's the sort of meditation I should be doing. This asceticism is a dead end. I need to go and practice what he called the middle way, which is one of the big themes in Buddhism, the middle way. And in this context, what the middle way means is neither the extreme of sensuous luxury, fulfilling all your sensual desires, which is sort of what he lived, frankly, when he was young in these various palaces. He had experienced that form of extremism, nor was it the extremism of this extreme asceticism, where you just sort of starved yourself to death, because that, basically it doesn't lead you anywhere. So he said, what you need to do is practice a midway in between it. And so that became, and so he decided to do that. And so some people around him helped him, gave him some food. He recovered his health, and then he sat down and decided, I'm going to just meditate and I'm going to solve this problem. And that's when he achieved the Nirvana, or enlightenment, under the Bodhi tree at around the age of 35. And then from that time afterwards, from the age of 35 until he died around the age of 80, he was a spiritual teacher. So those are sort of the main high points of what we know about Buddha's life. There are some other things that one can read, but basically there were not a lot of details about Buddha's life, but mainly what the recordings, the Buddhist scriptures, the original early Buddhist scriptures, came in 3 forms. The sutras, which described all of the teachings that Buddha gave as he wandered around and taught Dharma to different groups of people. The second form is the Vinaya, the monastic rules. And the third actually really sort of mainly developed after Buddha died. It's called the Abhidharma, the higher teachings of Dharma, where it tries to, in a complete logical path, lay out the whole philosophy of Buddhism, as you like, to try to organize the teachings. And the Abhidharma really grew up because in the early days, Buddha would just give different teachings to different people and would teach according to what he felt the different people needed to hear. But for the young students coming up, this was too random. There were just too many random teachings, and it was helpful. So the elder monks developed this method of sort of organizing all of the teachings in sort of a systematic path that could be taught. And that's ultimately how the Abhidharma arose. But these original sutras actually record almost all of the different teachings that Buddha gave in his 45 years of teachings. And there's, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 thick volumes of recording all of these teachings where he talked about a huge number of different topics. Okay, so and so finally, so I got to end the story. I was giving you Buddha's life, but I didn't finish the story. So of course, the ending is when the Buddha died, and that is called, sometimes it's called parinirvana, is the terminology. And so at that point, the Buddha's mind was fully enlightened, but he still had the physical body that he was born with, and that suffered from all of the defects of a physical body, of anybody's physical body. And of course, as the Buddha always said, everything in samsara that is born must die. And so, of course, his body had to die. And so when he died, then his body died, but he was achieved full enlightenment at that point. And so that was called parinirvana. And as I said, just before he died, he refused to appoint an official leader of Buddhism. And in fact, what he said, which is quite interesting, is he told all of his followers to be an island unto yourself, to be led by the Dharma, by the teachings he gave. And actually, this word for island can also be translated as lamp. So you should either be an island or a lamp unto yourself and base all of what you do on the Dharma teachings that he gave. And it's quite interesting. So it's again this sort of self-reliance, this sort of sense that we ourselves have to take charge of our own enlightenment. And the reason for this confusion between island or lamp is because the Pali language is a dialect of the Sanskrit language. It's sort of like going from Shakespearean English to modern English. And when they simplified the language, as dialects often become, some of the letters become fused together. And so the word for in Pali for island or lamp is dipa. And it has both of these meanings in Pali because it can be derived from 2 different Sanskrit words. One of the Sanskrit words means lamp, and one of them means island. And I actually think that the Buddha meant both of these meanings. The Buddha was he loved language. He was very good with language. I'm sure that he understood all the nuances. And if there was this ambiguity in this terminology, I'm sure it was placed there purposely. So anyway, so that's Buddha's life in a nutshell. Trying to, again, so we can, because we have to go through all of Buddhism in these 4 sessions of an hour and a half. So that's, I think, the best I can do. So now what I want to do is turn to the history of Buddhism. So I'm going to give a little bit about how Buddhism spread, and that'll probably take up the remainder of this session. And the next section, I'm really going to go back to these 4 noble truths and explain them in great detail, because all Buddhists, no matter what sect, whether you're a Zen Buddhist, Tibetan Buddhist, Theravadan Buddhist, no matter what country you come from, what form of Buddhism you practice, the core of the Buddhist teachings are these 4 noble truths. And so it's very important to sort of get the nuances and understand how they work. And then after that, I will go on to talk about a more elaborate sort of path of Buddhism, which in Tibetan Buddhism is called lamrim. It's developed by Lama Tsongkhapa around 1400. And through that vehicle, there's a very short text, which I actually, in these classes, I used to have more time in these classes, but I want to actually be able to read the text. But it sort of, again, covers all of the terminology, and that will lead us into Mahayana Buddhism, which is the dominant form of Buddhism today. And I will spend a long time explaining Mahayana Buddhism because of its great importance, how it works and what the idea is, and how it's similar or different from the original Buddhism that Buddha taught. And of course, the short answer is, I think it's basically just one way of looking at it is it expands and adds emphasis on certain things that the Buddha originally taught. So I think it's completely consonant with Buddha's original thing. But anyway, it's quite interesting and it's quite powerful. And that is the form that you're most likely to run into Buddhism in the West. Okay, so that's sort of the plan. So let me continue on with the history of Buddhism. So we've gone up to the death of Buddha. So Buddha achieving Nirvana. So when he did that, then the question became for all of these thousands of monks who had been following Buddha, what do we do? And what they decided to do is they decided to hold a council. And so not too long after Buddha died, certainly I think within the first year, they held a council where they actually sort of decided on the, if you like, the main texts of Buddhists. So they, especially the Vinaya, the rules of the Vinaya, and the sutras. And especially they relied very heavily on Ananda, who was Buddha's assistant during the second half of his life to help. Ananda had this phenomenal memory, and they were relying very heavily on him to remember all of the teachings that Buddha gave. And they had a giant recitation where they actually recited the entire Buddhist canon at that time, which are mainly these two texts. And actually, for the first couple hundred years after Buddha died, all of these texts exist only in the minds of the monks. They were not written down. There wasn't much writing that was done in India at that time. And this is actually not so different than the Hindu Vedas, because originally all the Hindu Vedas were also memorized. And the Indian tradition at that time was extremely good at memorizing long texts, extremely careful, never even missing a single word. And that's how the original Buddhist sutras and Vinaya were passed down. And so some of us, it may seem hard to believe for modern people that this was possible. However, it's useful to give a modern analogy. I saw a TV show, I don't know, maybe 5-10 years ago on this one interesting very show on the Muslim religion. And what the show was about is it was showing that they had this contest in the Muslim world for boys to memorize the Quran. And and when you did this memorization of the Quran, it was not only memorizing all of the words of the Quran, but there's actually a long tradition in that religion of how you pronounce this. Sometimes you're supposed to raise your voice, you're supposed to put a little pause in here or run through this, there's this whole elaborate tradition about how it's pronounced. So it's more than just the words themselves, it's this whole thing that you have to memorize. So very, very elaborate. And these young boys from 8 years to maybe 20 years would have this contest from all over the Arab world to memorize this Quran in this great detail. And the amazing thing is large numbers of them do it. And what is even more remarkable in my mind is that many of these young boys don't know Arabic. So essentially, they're just, if you like, memorizing gibberish. They don't know what the words mean. And yet they can remember in great detail every pause, every intonation of all of these words for the entire Quran. So anyway, the whole point of this is this, that human memory is astounding. And back in ancient times, people developed highly developed memories, and what they could memorize was pretty amazing. So anyway, so for the first couple of 100 years, so anyway, in this first council, they sort of established the Buddhist canon, if you like. And then very quickly after that, they sort of broke up, Buddhism sort of broke up into 18 sub-schools. Some people say as many as 50 sub-schools. Part of this was geographical, because these monks sometimes monks came from faraway lands to become a disciple of the Buddha. And then after the Buddha died, they would move back to their original country. So Buddhism essentially spread all throughout India, even though its origins was in northern India. Almost some parts of it were actually, some people think, in southern Nepal. So anyway, so part of it was geographical. And again, there were certain very elder monks who were very powerful, deeply spiritual leaders, many of them themselves liberated, and they would lead a cluster of students or disciples who would follow them. So again, because there was no Pope of Buddhism, there was sort of all this fragmentation. The only thing that was consistent, what really made a difference for the early monks, was actually the Vinaya rules, how to live together in harmony. So actually, again, I mean, in the West, because of Christianity, there's this whole focus on what you believe is so important. And, in the Reformation, after the Renaissance, all of these different Christians were burning each other at the stake because maybe they deviated by 0.1% what they believed. And there was all this discord and stuff. And there's this huge thing in our Western tradition about belief and what you believe and being absolutely certain about that. But in Buddhism, it's never been that way. It's really been about how you live. And in fact, later on, when the Mahayana tradition arose, the Mahayana monks of the Mahayana tradition, who believed these additional things that were different than the other monks, there was no problem. All the monks lived in harmony because they followed the same Vinaya rules. So anyway, I think that's sort of an interesting thing. And we know that this is true because there were actually pilgrims from China who wandered around through India, observed all of these monasteries, and then went back to China and wrote up reports, which still exist today. And you can read them today if you know Chinese or ancient Chinese, I guess. So anyway, so that's how Buddhism began. And after that, the history of Buddhism is actually spreading away from India to many other countries. And this spread happened over maybe 1,000 years in a certain sense. So to just give you a feeling for it, the earliest way that it spread was to southern India. And there's a big island off the southern part called, now in modern days called Sri Lanka. For many years, it was called Ceylon. And that was sort of the first place that the first new country, even though it was almost part of India, that it spread to. And that happened around the couple hundred years after the Buddha passed away. It was during the period of time when Ashoka was ruling a large part of India. So in the 200s BC, basically. And that tradition actually became what's known as the modern Theravadan tradition. which is centered in Sri Lanka still, but spread to Burma and Thailand and all that part of the world, and still exists, and has centers in the United States also. And so that is sort of the thing, the form of Buddhism that's probably closest to the Buddhism that Buddha actually was there when Buddha was alive. Okay. And again, I think partially because it maintains sort of this Indian tradition. And so this Pali text that I was talking about is the one that was carried off to Sri Lanka at this earlier period around in the 3rd century BC. And then Buddhism itself spread throughout most of India, but still the most powerful center of Buddhism in India always tended to remain in the north. And over many, many centuries, actually great Buddhist monasteries like Nalanda grew up and actually developed a large amount of Buddhist philosophy. And because the Hindus were there was always some sort of rivalry between the Hindus and the Buddhists. Eventually the Buddhists switched from the local dialects into Sanskrit, the intellectual language of India, so they could debate with the Muslims. So for most of the time in India, the language of Buddhism was actually this intellectual language of Sanskrit. Okay. And then, okay, let me just finish in order not to go in too many different directions at once. Let me just finish with India. So especially from, like the 1st to the 7th century AD, there was a large amount of very famous Buddhist philosophy that was developed in India in these great universities. One of the most important developments that came about in India happened around the birth of Christ, maybe a little before, maybe a little after. And this was of course, it had nothing to do with Christ whatsoever. It's just the time period when this developed just happened to coincide with that. So if we're using our calendar, we say it's around this switchover between BC and AD. But anyway, this was the emergence of the Mahayana form of Buddhism, which, as I've said before, became the dominant form of Buddhism all throughout the world. The other major thing that happened was Tantric Buddhism, which began to appear somewhere around 700 AD. So that was also a significant development because, as I will explain later on, my last class, I'll actually talk about what Tantric Buddhism is. Tantric Buddhism is actually, if you like, sort of an extension of the Mahayana path. And I'll talk more about it in the last class. Okay, but then the other most important thing that happened in India is actually Buddhism got wiped out in India. So here we are, India, the birthplace where Buddha was born, and it is basically completely wiped out around 1200 AD. And since 1200 AD, there's been very little Buddhism in India itself. Now in modern times, there's been some Buddhists who've been moving back. But essentially, it got wiped out. And it's not entirely clear why it got wiped out. However, one contributing factor of this is at the time it got wiped out, there were huge Muslim invasions of northern India. So, in the modern day, what was originally India is split in half between Muslims and Hindus. And that's because of these huge Muslim invasions that were in around the time that Buddhism. So the Muslims came in, and and of course the Buddhists are not warriors. You're in Buddhism, you don't kill people. So it was very easily for the Muslims to just go in. They just went in and they slaughtered all the monks in these large monasteries, and they destroyed a lot of the Buddhist manuscripts and texts, actually. And the reason why we have a lot of the Buddhist texts that we have today is because they were carried off either to places like Tibet, China, or of course some to Sri Lanka, the Theravadan form. But anyway, there were these Muslim invasions, and so they were wiping out a lot of the Buddhists in northern India. And there's also some evidence that the Hindus colluded in this destruction of Buddhism. Buddhism was always sort of a thorn in the side of the Hindus because of the caste system. The caste system is essential to Indian society, and especially the Brahmins were all powerful, and they wanted that power, and they didn't like Buddhists sort of complaining about that, because essentially when Buddha was alive, he said the caste system is nonsense. What makes you a noble person is not who your parents are, but whether you're a good person or not. You know, it's your spiritual level that determines your nobility, not your birth. And because of that, however, the authority of the Brahmins and their place as the top spot in Indian society was based on the caste system. So the Brahmins always wanted to get rid of the Buddhists. And so there is some suggestions in the records that when the Muslims came in, it was maybe they saw that as an opportune time to sort of help out a little bit. But nonetheless, either way, no matter what happened, Buddhism was essentially wiped out. So then you have to ask yourself, how did Buddhism survive? And the way it survived, of course, is that it spread to many other countries in the intervening time. And probably one of the places that it spread to early on was actually, okay. So basically, so I said the earliest part were these people that went to Sri Lanka, roughly in the 3rd century BC. Around the 1st century AD, people started going to China. And so Buddhism was spreading to China. And there were different waves of Buddhism that spread to China. And in fact, there were many different forms of Buddhism that developed in China, a large number of different Buddhist sects that developed in China, including the famous Zen Buddhism, which I'll talk about. So anyway, so starting as early as the 1st century AD, you had people heading off to China. In the 2nd century AD, you get people spreading further away from Sri Lanka into Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, sort of Southeast Asia. And then, okay. And then I think for us, probably because, just using the forms of Buddhism we're familiar with, probably the most important Buddhism that we're familiar with in the West is Zen Buddhism, which is, I think, called Chan Buddhism. So that began in China. And let's see, I had it written down when it, okay. Now I've, oh yeah. So Zen Buddhism began by a famous monk in India called Bodhidharma. And then around the 4th to 5th century AD, and then later on, it, of course, after that was spreading to China in the 500 ADs. And then later on, it was spreading into Korea around the 7th century AD. And then eventually it reached all the way into Japan, which is probably the most familiar form that we're familiar with from Zen. So that was much later, around the 12th century AD, that it spreading from Korea and China into Japan. And of course, Zen itself is also not just one single uniform sect. There's many different forms of Zen Buddhism, all centered around great spiritual leaders who taught sort of their variation of Zen. And there's at least 3 major schools of Zen, even only in Japan. So you've got different forms in China, Korea, and so forth, and probably different sorts there also. And of course, many other forms of Buddhism besides Zen Buddhism in China, large numbers of different types of sects. And again, there was this sort of commonality that a lot of the way it spread is there would be some extremely deep spiritual leader who just inspired a lot of people, and followers would grow up around him. And so then he would teach his variation of Buddhism, sort of teaching the things that he found helpful, that helped him on his spiritual path. And so a little tradition would grow up around him. And again, because there was no Pope of Buddhism to tell you, you got to do it this way and not this way, people were sort of free to experiment, and sort of Buddhism kept evolving. Okay, and then of course, later on, especially in the last 50 years, it was Buddhism spread heavily to the West. So the one place I left out was Tibet. And since we're a Tibetan center, that's really important. So how did Buddhism go to Tibet? And so Buddhism went to Tibet, well, I'll round it off, roughly 800 AD with Padmasambhava. So he came from India to Tibet, taught Buddhism in Tibet, and that was the original form of one of the 4 Buddhist traditions, which is called the Nyingma tradition, which still exists today. In fact, that's the second largest form of Buddhism in the Tibetan form. The biggest is the Gelugpa, which I will come to. So anyway, Padmasambhava came, he taught Buddhism, but then within roughly about 100 years, Buddhism started falling apart. It was decayed. There was one Tibetan king who didn't like Buddhism, who eliminated it. And I think he was actually maybe assassinated. And then later on, a short time after that, Buddhism was, there was a Buddhist king who was asking Buddhists from India to come and bring Buddhist teachings back and to revive it in Tibet. And the big event of that was Atisha, who arrived at 1042. So 1008, roughly 1000 AD, we'll call it. So he comes to Tibet, he revives Buddhism in Tibet. And then, of course, Buddhism is strong in Tibet from then on for the rest of time. So there were like I said, there were 4 major traditions in Tibet. The original one was the Nyingma. And the next major form was started by Marpa and Milarepa, who were famous Tibetans, spiritual leaders. They were deep meditators, very powerful meditators. And that became the Kagyu form of Tibetan Buddhism, which is to this day led by the Karmapa. And so this began around the time that Atisha had come, around 1000 AD. And then not too long after that, maybe 100 years after that, the next form of Buddhism was started, which was called the Sakya tradition. And that still exists today. And essentially the Nyingma was sort of the original form of Buddhism. The Kagyus focused very heavily on meditation. They are great meditators. The Sakya was more of an intellectual form of Buddhism. So they were sort of following the Indian philosophical tradition of Buddhism. And so they became sort of the great scholars of Tibetan Buddhism. And they were responsible for translating a lot of Indian Buddhism from Sanskrit into Tibetan. So they were these amazing translators. And so we have the Sakyans to thank for a lot of the Buddhist scripts that survived from India into Tibet. And then later on, there was another great reformer, Lama Tsongkhapa, who we can round it off to roughly 1400 AD, who thought that Buddhism was degenerating a little bit, that a lot of the monks were having sexual relationships with women and various things were going on. And so he led sort of a reform movement, and he was an immense, powerful scholar. He was a child prodigy. He knew every form of Buddhism available in Tibet backwards and forwards. And he became a great leader, and he started the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism, which has, since his time, always been the very largest sect of Tibetan Buddhism, far larger than probably the other three put together. And Dalai Lama has always formally belonged to this Gelugpa form, although especially today with the invasion of Tibet by China in the late 1940s and the dispersion of Tibetans all over the world, today the Dalai Lama tries to be very neutral and to represent all four sects very equally and very even-handedly. And that's, is really the Dalai Lama is really the savior of all of the Tibetans, and he's deeply revered. But formally, he's like I say, he's a Gelugpa. And I should say that the center that we belong to, TNL, Tibetan Norling, is a Tibetan center, so a Tibetan form of Buddhism in the Gelugpa tradition. So again, that's sort of the terminology. So I can see that we've hit 8:30, and I hate to, people often have to stay up late for this, and I don't want to make people tired or whatever. So I usually try to stop around 8:30 for that reason. And so I will end here because this is fortunately, it turned out that this is a good natural ending point, because we've sort of gone over the rough history. And like I say, next time we're going to pretty much spend the whole session on the Four Noble Truths. And that gives us an opportunity to talk in great detail about many different aspects of Buddhism. But the whole idea, especially I think we're going over the Four Noble Truths, is really to help you get a feel for the spirit of Buddhism, how Buddhism really works, how do Buddhists think, how do they react to this world? What is their worldview? And these Four Noble Truths, I think, are wonderful. And along with that, we'll begin introducing some of these big topics like karma, reincarnation, a lot of the other things that people really care about and wonder how they work. And, what is the real truth? We talk about these terminology in Western civilization in a very, rough way, but how do the Buddhists really view all of these concepts, and what does it mean to them? And of course, we'll talk more about what does enlightenment mean, Nirvana, what is the spiritual path, and how do you follow that path? So we'll keep getting more and more practical as we go along. But again, because I'm covering such a huge amount of material in just 4 very short sessions, I can't go too great into detail. But what I always try to do is I try to get into enough detail so that you can actually get a sense of what people actually do, how they actually practice, and what the terminology really means. Because I think that that's important. You need enough detail. If you're at too high a level, it just sort of, you don't really learn anything. So I try to balance those two to make it through everything in 4 sessions, but still to give you enough detail that you really get a very real sense of how things work. And so I will end here, but I'll just ask, are there any questions? Because I'm happy, if you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question, that would be perfectly fine. But on the other hand, I don't want to put you on the spot. So, okay, it's perfectly fine not to ask any questions. But there is that opportunity. If you have questions, If not today, then next session, you can always ask questions. I'm always happy to ask questions. Sometimes I have trouble finishing the course because people ask too many questions, and that's wonderful. So, okay. So with that, I will end this first class of Buddhism in a Nutshell, and I hope to see you next week, same time, same Zoom session. Thank you.